also thank you to everyone here. I mean, the Accelerator community for welcoming me today to join you. This amazing cohort, I think, of collaborators, decarb experts, educators, all of you I know are very passionate about this work. Education is just so important to how we build out the lasting nature really of the building decarbonization work. I mean, of course, yes, this work is urgent. Yes, the impacts of a changing climate are rapidly affecting people locally, globally, rural, urban, but this is a fight we're going to be in for a long time, right? So we need to empower generations of climate activists to become a climate workforce and a climate economy. And I think that's part of the driving force here. I think it's part of why the work of this accelerator is taking on, and now like kind of developments in the school as a whole are going to be so important. I was thinking a lot about this last week. Last week was particularly special for me. I had the honor of returning to my alma mater to deliver a commencement address at Carnegie Mellon School of Architecture to the graduating class of 2022. It was a bit surreal to return, a couple of decades later to the moment where I began a lot of, the work to craft my role in the built environment. But more so, I think it was fascinating for me to consider what might be relevant to those that are beginning to carve out their own path. And I think it was important for me to emphasize to those students and both undergraduate, graduate there that this unlivable climate like future that we're trying to avoid, it's a villain of our own creation. And I simply put, we designed our way into this crisis, and so we're going to have to design our way out. And that's why this accelerator is so important, and when Peter first told me about the accelerator, it was clear to me that you were actively trying to provide those toolkits, empower the workers of that decarbonization economy to effectively scale and design our way out. So I was very eager to connect and be able to talk with you today and hopefully begin a conversation about like some of the pieces that I believe to be critical in this work. I think this is meant to be something where it's the beginning of a conversation and not just a one-off. But I think that we have to recognize that a lot of this is going to be, students in classrooms and in institutions that are going to bear the burden of that large design project. And so part of it is my job to help pave that way as much as possible, clear a path, and to potentially remove obstacles for them to be as successful as possible. So as Peter mentioned, I am currently Senior Director for Building Emissions and Community Resilience at the White House. In addition to doing that, I'm also an architect, but I'm someone who's very passionate about improving the physical world we live in. And given that our buildings account for over a third of our climate altering carbon pollution, I believe that it's the work, of all of us that support the built environment. So, educators, those design professionals, construction, real estate, operations and maintenance, like we all have a very important role to play. And so I couldn't be more thrilled not only to join you, but to work every day on behalf of President Biden to help decarbonize our built environment. We're confronted with more and more tangible and experiential evidence, every day that our climate is changing rapidly. And, I focus my time on, trying to think about how do we build buildings better? How do we make existing buildings where we spend 90% of each day more efficient and increasingly electrified, so they can stop burning fossil fuels and we can take advantage of the clean electricity generation that's beginning to happen all around us. And thinking about how do we make those buildings more resilient and less fragile as we respond to coastal storms and drought and flooding and wildfire and the most deadly of them all, which is beginning soon, is extreme heat. So that's important to kind of think about both the resilience components as well as the efficiencies. And it's also important to kind of remember something, that it's only one part of the solution. We all know that climate change and inequality are inextricably linked. And so inclusive climate action really means that we have to make the people inside these buildings more resilient, healthier, and more able to take part and thrive in the great generational work we're proposing as of building out this carbon-free future. So it's a future that requires all of us, and so we have to, consider how we enable all of us to participate in that future. And that's kind of why we're here and why we're able to kind of join forces in this effort. Those of us on the climate team and CAQ have been hard at work for the last 15 months, undoing some of the policies of the past administration that were not as responsive to climate change, and working to unlock, I think, the true decarbonization potential of the federal government. And that's with executive orders, it's with our 50 to 52% NDC, which is our nationally determined contribution, the amount of emissions reductions that we are targeting between now and 2030. Of course, the bipartisan infrastructure law, and just like good old fashioned, like leading by example. And I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. But I do think it's important to talk a little bit about like unlocking the inertia around building retrofits. I think this is part of like, this is an audience that I think speaks, that language. And so, it's just critical to make sure that not only are we unlocking the potential of that, but then we are accelerating those efforts once they've begun, right? So that it's lasting and so it's happening everywhere, and that everyone is able to benefit from the important work in a way that doesn't just exacerbate some inequalities in some locations versus others. And that's why the importance of environmental and social justice is so important to how we tackle the climate crisis. But unlocking things starts at the top, right? And so last year, the president issued executive order, announcing bold targets to achieve carbon pollution free power sector by 2035, and put the United States on what we believe to be an irreversible path to a net zero economy by 2050. So recognizing the opportunity and of retrofitting and modernizing our nation's existing buildings that it presents, the president also promised to build and rehabilitate and retrofit millions of homes and commercial buildings across the country. And so this effort really set out a vision for all of us to help create domestic manufacturing opportunities, for like electric heating and cooling technology, and investing in research and development to spur smart building advances and forge, collaborations that will enable a lot more of a lot more buildings to be powered by that clean electricity. And so, unlike a lot of past significant investments, this plan also at the core of it addresses long-standing and persistent racial injustice. So it's what we refer to as Justice 40 is the overall kind of work that the administration puts forward to target 40% of the benefits of all of our climate and clean infrastructure investments to be targeted towards disadvantaged communities. So there's a theme here, obviously, but there's also a really intentional thought that's put into how we spend the money, how that money is going to not just achieve the emissions reductions, but again, unlock the ability for more people to participate in this future. And on the federal side, the White House and agencies, we've been prioritizing all of these unlocking actions, like updating codes and many of which have just fallen off their normal cycles, which is another kind of legacy of the past administration. And so we, with the Department of Energy and other agencies, for example, we announced the adoption of a series of latest consensus-based codes. That's IEC C 2021, ASHRAE 90.1. Sorry, my windows are open, so there's good fresh air, so there might be some additional noise from the streets. But all work and building codes helps unlock national building cycles across the country, which raises the bar for local and state governments and provides a lot of additional support, we believe, for and validation to move forward and to make sure that jurisdictions that are already pushing it will have that support to continue going forward. Code cycles are usually every 3 years, so we want to keep that pressure up to make sure that they're benefiting from those. And then using these advanced codes as a stepping stone towards other beneficial electrification of buildings. And that's a great way for us to kind of be at the forefront of this work. And one of the key pieces at the forefront of this work, and something that I've been advocating for quite some time, is a new era of codes and standards. I'm a huge proponent of building performance standards. Building performance standards are the most powerful policy tool that we've had in a generation available to really drive near and long-term investments in building performance. And so, before I began working at the White House, I directed sustainability, of course, for New York, and we were able to pass something called Local Law 97, which many of you might be familiar with, the most ambitious building emissions legislation enacted by any city in the world. And long story short, it set carbon caps on most large buildings, 25,000 square feet or above. And those caps kick in 2024, and then will become more stringent over time. So it's exciting because, you know, those will eventually help reduce, you know, the New York City's emissions 80% by 2050, but also, you know, these caps are starting to go, they're going to go in effect, you know, 2 years from now. And so then it's like, the work is starting to be able to meet those requirements. And like with labor unions and trades and like, you know, building operations and construction folks are like all kind of working towards these outcomes. There's also tons of folks working to undo those laws. But keep in mind, it's just like, that's the nature of change. You have to consistently set the agenda and then fight for it as you go on and on. But when you start to do that type of work, it sends signals to other sectors. It's like, oh, it sends signals because we need to then increase the work around financing to make sure that building owners can make these investments. At the same time, we did Local Law 97 in New York. We also passed the city's first ability to do PACE loans. PACE is property assessed clean energy, like financing for a lot of energy improvements. Great work that allows for building owners to have additional access to capital to make these investments. And so it's exciting to kind of see that these different sectors starting to speak to one another all around the work of decarbonization. And that's the promise of decarbonizing, right? Is that you invest in this infrastructure in our built environment and it becomes catalytic. And more industries see the benefits, see the value add, and then they allow for themselves to be positioned to benefit from that. And that creates good jobs and it creates healthier indoor environments for everybody. And so when I came to the White House, it was important to me to apply that same logic in ways that we could have lasting national impact. And so we started to kind of work on that in two different ways. And that's kind of like two things I really just want to talk to you about today. And I really want to get to, if there's time for questions, that's kind of, I think, where a lot of the most interesting part of this conversation happens. But you know, one of the ways in which we led by example is that last May during the Better Building Summit, the Department of Energy Better Building Summit, which starts today, by the way, this year, for the next 2 days, those of you that are tuning in remotely, I think they're in person this year. We, in addition to a lot of agency announcements, we announced the first ever development of the federal building performance standards policy. And that, you know, that's amazing because the federal government has one of the largest and most diverse portfolio of buildings. And so to launch this interagency effort with GSA, DOE, EPA to establish like the metrics, the targets, tracking methods, you know, to reach these federal emissions reduction goals has not been done before. And it creates like such a great opportunity for what's possible. And the performance standards are not only an important tool for federal agencies to decarbonize and electrify their buildings, but also serves as like a clarion call, I think, to portfolio owners across the country that this is a priority and that this is a transformative climate policy effort for building stock. And so that policy, of course, is still under development. It's a lot of technical aspects, but we've been able to assemble like a multi-agency kind of design team to troubleshoot and get early buy-in for this transformative policy. And we'll be excited to roll it out in the near term. And so while we're like leading by example in the federal portfolio, it's also important, you know, and that's an important way to unlock this work in a lot of other places. Accelerating this work across the country is also like critical path to meeting this moment successfully. And that, you know, there needs to be examples of this type of policy development in big cities and small cities all across the country so that there's more clarity that this is something that is achievable and accessible. And so it wasn't just New York City, but as a result of New York, there were efforts seen in other cities in Washington, D.C., Washington State, Boston, let's see, Chula Vista in California, Colorado State, St. Louis, Montgomery County, Maryland, maybe a few others, Boston I might have mentioned. So they're started to kind of develop these building performance standards and set these caps that each time a city did it, they actually improved on the model before them, which really set a lot of clear potential for why this matters. And so the question was, how do we accelerate this work, you know, from this position? And so we developed something and launched this in January, and some of you may be familiar. The federal, like the White House and along with agencies, we launched the Building Performance Standards Coalition. Fortunately, President Biden was able to announce this during his remarks at the U.S. Conference of Mayors, that the administration was teaming up with cities and labor and industry to launch the coalition, which was a first of its kind partnership between 33 states and local governments dedicated to delivering cleaner, healthier, and more affordable buildings. Within those 33 initial members, there's about 20% of the nation's building footprint in their jurisdictions. That partnership helps facilitate commitments, and to design and implement these performance standards, but also like really kind of look forward around how they're going to use this to create good paying jobs, union jobs, lower energy bills for consumers, keep residents and workers safe, from harmful pollution, and really cut emissions in the building sector. And those 33 state and local governments, they part of being a part of this coalition is that they made commitments to work with stakeholders, particularly frontline communities, to address health and energy affordability and emissions reduction goals. The participation in this also requires and will get assisted to develop policy roadmaps, convening place-based teams to co-create policy locally, identifying and acting on a lot of the prerequisites that may be like benchmarking or other pieces that go alongside that. And then helping to look at those complementary policies that, like I mentioned, the PACE financing before, but there's tons of other policies, particularly around housing, that really can be combined with work on emissions reduction and truly make this work in the built environment have far more potential for success, because you're addressing underlying issues as well. And so it's really exciting. The work has begun. We've been meeting with the cohorts, prioritizing, again, the equity experience also in some of the stakeholders, mobilizing the federal side, the technical assistance for building performance policy, so that they can kind of directly work with different jurisdictions on their needs at local levels, enhancing the work that's coming from EPA also around supporting the policy development and implementation, using the kind of Energy Star portfolio manager, as well as EPA making commitments to develop new tools that can help calculate local like greenhouse gas emissions and like inform some of their reporting and compliance and assessment. So really exciting stuff, at least from my perspective. And I think what they really committed to doing also is doing this hard work, this heavy lifting, which also includes enacting some level of local legislation, like laws or regulation. They have to do this between now and Earth Day 2024. You have 2 years to develop these building performance standards, and this will allow for us to unlock, again, 20% of the gross square footage of these big buildings across the country, and let that be, again, a catalyst for action, so that all the work that all of you are doing to increase the literacy, increase the expertise in this field will have a place to land. And now you can go and check out all the cities that are listed. And again, it's across the country, big cities, small cities. And those are the places that now have a really critical path action item that they've publicly committed to alongside the president to be able to do this work. So work with them, or let them work with you. I think that's part of how we grow this team together, and how we recognize the fact that buildings are where we're going to experience the transition to the carbon-free economy. So as we decarbonize the power sector and transition to zero emission vehicles, with all the charging and batteries that comes along with that, all those clean electrons, they're going to flow through buildings. And so I think it's just important to recognize that this sector is going to really play an important role in how, we all, and the public and those that are not like in this particular industry, will experience the transition. And so being able to be in a place where we're providing those important resources, it matters, and it will continue to matter as a critical kind of backdrop and home for this decarbonized economy. So I remain excited to work with all of you, as well as to kind of support this work. And I'm excited to see how thoughtful you've been around some of the work with universities that have incredible, talented students that were not for this symposium are not getting the attention they deserve. So I really appreciate that, and I think it's part of how we make sure that we're moving all these pieces forward at the same time. So I'll stop talking, because I know I've been rambling on for a long time, but I'm excited, and hopefully we get a chance to keep this conversation going.
Great. Oh, Mark, thank you so much. You know, I love what you're saying is that we designed ourselves into this. That's sort of sad, but the good news is we can design ourselves out of this, right? So I'm ready. Let me start. First, let me tell participants, if you have a question for Mark, please write it in the chat, and then Avril will sort through those and moderate the questions, okay? So please do that. Now, if I could start by asking a question of you, you've obviously in your career met, thousands of professionals working on, lowering energy use and decarbonizing buildings. What if you were talking to some students, and there are students on the call today, what are the skills that they need to pay attention to and pick up while they're in college and hone in the early part of their career to be able to make a difference?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question. Another thing that I touched upon in my conversation last week with students. So first of all, I kind of acknowledge that like a lot of times, students are in a great place right now, right? They can learn in a weekend on their phone, like classes that took me like an entire semester, with the equivalent of like a stone tablet. And I think that like allows for them to prioritize excellence in their kind of like capacity to utilize a lot of the tools that exist in this world. So what I mean by that is, I don't think that there is a paradigm in which there's only this many folks that can contribute to this work. No matter what your passion is and where you're fit into this model, I think you can bend it towards the climate work. And I think that all of it, there's places for you to intersect consistently. That being said, a lot of the work around that's going to be more compelling as we go forward is going to require certain technical know-how, like how we are truly. I use the term like electrons as currency, but like how we are really evaluating the clean electrons that are coming into buildings and how we are making sure that we're getting as much value as possible for those. So so students are kind of wanting you to think about it that way of like, you're going to have clean electrons coming in from the grid. As grids you get more and more decarbonized, that clean electricity is going to have an inherent value over dirty electricity. We're trying to make buildings more electric, so that's going to be the framework that we're working through. So then how do I make sure that I'm getting as much value as possible out of those clean electrons? Is it going into a battery storage? Is it going into my zero emission vehicle? Is it going into something that some other kind of way in which I'm now putting that into some kind of market that it's allowing me to benefit from other people that need those clean electrons? Like that's the thought process, and the tools that help you enable that are going to be, I think, at a premium for those that want to be at the head of the field as we go forward.
Yeah, great. So Avril's going to jump in and read some of the questions from the chat. Yeah.
Mark, thank you so much for a great talk. So I'm just gonna start with some of the questions from our audience. So the first one we got is from Nick Miley, and he says that as a structural engineer, I'm very keyed into the emissions that come from production of all of the materials that go into the building. Does your office have plans to regulate or invest in ways to reduce embodied carbon emissions in buildings?
Short answer is yes. I would say that the fastest, industrial emissions is going to be critical, and kind of thinking about how we're looking at life cycle emissions and embodied carbon is critical. Concrete, of course, is a huge portion of that. I would point you to look at some of the work that GSA and DOE have been doing recently around commitments to kind of develop different paths to reduce the carbon intensity of some of those projects. At the White House, what we end up doing are things that are called fact sheets. So whenever there is a particular item that needs to be addressed, like a lot of times we'll issue a fact sheet that kind of points you in all the different directions. So I believe there's one that kind of talks a little bit about some of the concrete work that GSA is prioritizing. And if not, I'm sure I can help you find that. But that's a great example of what they're doing. And the hope is that that creates also a larger platform for industry to also look at different ways that to reduce some of the emissions that go into some of the larger ticket construction items.
Great, thank you. We actually don't have any other audience questions right now. I think maybe people are still a little asleep. So
Yeah.
if anybody else has a question, please feel free to put it in the Q&A. And maybe
Yeah.
Peter, I don't know if you have another question for Mark.
Yeah. Look, I've got lots of questions, Mark. I could go on, but anyway, please do write your questions into the chat. This is your chance. But Mark, let me ask you a question. Are there good jobs in this area? You know, I think one of the things that students are thinking about is, and that professors need to talk to their students about is, you know, where are the jobs over the coming decade or two, and where are going to be the jobs that not only are there, but are going to be challenging and exciting?
Yeah, so I mean, it's tough, right? Because I think that one of the challenges of a transition is that you don't necessarily have the certain path of you do this and it equates to this and this and this, and this is how your progression in different industries work. But I also feel like that flexibility is something that those that are coming out of school and kind of early on in their career have now come to expect. It's like they're a little bit more discerning with who they're working for. And so I think that level of discernment is important to keep going forward. It's like you're going to be changing the industry that you're working in by your presence and by the kind of demands you're making of it. And that is a very powerful place to be in. It doesn't make it easy. It doesn't mean that all of a sudden you're not just picking from job A, B, or C, but you are starting to recognize that part of this transition is going to be you finding places that value your opinion, value your voice, and that you use that value add to be able to help transition a lot of these businesses and organizations to a place in which they are truly doing their part in decarbonization. Because there's a role for every type of organization to play in this, and to be honest, like we're out of time, so they need to be bending those skill sets towards this effort. And I think a lot of these young people are going to be the ones that hold them accountable to do that.
Awesome. Avril, you want to?
Yeah, there's another audience question. So this one's a little California specific, but hopefully you can speak to it, Mark. So how do policies such as the attempt to limit rooftop solar by PG&E in California impact the work and leadership currently being done on the federal level?
So, I mean, I think that there's always going to be different dynamics like that are regional, local, even like national, but versus global. And I think that our work, or at least my work, is pretty kind of unmitigated by some of the differences that are happening, meaning that we know what we need to do. And there's so much work to be done that a lot of the ups and downs, the industry ups and downs that happen in some of these locations are going to happen. I think that the part of the benefit of having a government and a president that's prioritizing this work is the fact that there's so many of us that are full steam ahead regardless. And so I do think that we'll find that, yeah, there are some like very delicate issues that are complicated, and there's always going to be those that are resistant to change. But I do think that there are a lot of us that are working on the true hard work of changing the policy like infrastructure as well as the regulatory infrastructure that helps to make some of those dips a lot less devastating to the industries that we know need to move forward.
Great, thank you. We have another question from Professor Robert Powell at NCAMT. He's actually one of the BDLA collaborators. So he asks, it seems your career has not been from a conventional track. Please describe some of the things you have done in this regard.
Oh, interesting. So
kind of a broad question, but I'm also interested.
So I'll, so here's the thing about architecture and some of the design fields is I believe them to be a little bit reactive in some ways, meaning that a lot of the design solutions happen in response to a problem or response to a program requirement. And so what became clear to me early on was that you have to cultivate an environment so that those good design decisions and responses can take place. And that cultivation happens in city halls and in, and in city council chambers and in voting booths. And so towards the end of my architecture education, I overlapped my undergraduate with my graduate work in public policy because it's something about that made more sense to me. That being said, I've done both, and I've worked as an architect, and I've also worked for local and national government, and also working consulting before too, of kind of high performance building consulting, and all of those things kind of point me in a direction of there are a lot of different ways to do this, and I think that what we're going to see is that there are no longer conventional paths. The path is actually, are you having impact or aren't you? And if you are not in a place that we're able to have a demonstrable impact in this larger work, and again, not just the work around your skill set, but that skill set in service of working on climate, then you're going to have to find something else. And I think those are the stakes right now. And so for me, I've always kind of bounced around where impact was possible, and it seems to open up more doors where you can have larger impact. And I think that is the lesson that I've taken, as opposed to believing that there is a more of a conventional path. That also, just while we're at it, there are conventional tracks also don't include everybody, right? And so conventional tracks often are exclusionary and do that in a way that makes industries very resistant to change, but also unwelcoming. And so I think that it's important for us to prioritize kind of more divergent paths to participate. And part of the way you do that is by making sure that your industries are doing the hard work of seeking out more diverse workforce and looking at how more people are able to use their talents and skills to contribute to these different sectors. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to galvanize the amount of resources and people resources that we need to meet this moment.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I love the answer. I think that's so important. Okay, we have a couple more on here. So this is kind of continuing on that thought. Do you think we have the workforce we need to support building performance standards for existing buildings? Or do you have recommendations for educators?
So, I mean, do we have the workforce we need? So no, we have the workers we need, but the workforce requires a certain kind of, it's a collection of folks working together to put those skilled individuals in service of these outcomes. So it's kind of the same piece of the narrative, that it's not that we don't have enough people, it's that the people aren't doing the things they need to be doing. And part of how that works is by organizations, public, private, and in between, making sure that they are holding themselves publicly accountable to work in the decarbonization economy. So like you don't get a pass. And if you don't get a pass and your workers don't get a pass, and you'll attract various kind of skilled workforce that can do the thing that you do in a way that's also in service of our climate and emissions objectives. Otherwise, we have a problem.
For sure. Great.
Okay, one last piece on that before you move on.
Yeah.
That also does put the onus on businesses, again, public-private entities, to invest in the training and skills of that workforce, to make sure that we're aligning, what they are learning with what they're going to need to be doing in service of this climate work. So it's not just a matter of holding up a shiny object and say that we have these ESG targets, or we have this this emissions goal. You actually have to do the work, and that is also going to mean investing in your existing workforce to make sure that they are part of that solution as well.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so the next one kind of veers off a bit back towards what you're talking about building performance standards. So Tom Kavat asks, how should cities compare adopting building performance standards to adopting straight up replace on burnout and replace on remodel ordinances?
Yeah, I'm here for all of that. I think that this is what you'll find out about like local government in particular, is that a lot of it has to do with like, what can you pass? Like what is the local environment, and where do you have the votes? And so if you have the votes for a all electric replacement for appliances, and or no commercial installations of new natural gas, or no, any of the things that are flying around the country in a lot of different iterations, and there's some really innovative stuff that's happening now, then do what you can do. I think that you'll find that some places are more willing to jump head first as opposed to others. But I think that you're going to see, and part of when we developed the Building Performance Standards Coalition, we kept some of the framework loose enough to recognize that people are going to do this differently. All the building performance standards that are in place right now, there's about 7 of them or so, they're all different. And they speak to the same kind of general notions, and like using this as a lever to incentivize the work, and also channeling the penalties towards some other collective good. But they used the best they had, in order to make it work and pass through their local jurisdiction. I think that's what you're going to find everywhere. That what we're also excited about as part of the coalition work is to develop a compendium of some of these different examples, so that you might find that, yeah, there might be option A, B, C, and D, but there's not like an option like LMNOP, right? It's probably going to end up being like a handful, a dozen or so different ways to do this. And we'd love for everyone to be able to pick from those in a way that works for them, and lets them prioritize the things that matter to their communities, and then get moving.
Great. I think that Professor Fisher might have a question. If I'll let him ask that.
Yeah, thank you, Mark, for your leadership and your many remarks, and also outlining all the hard work that's ahead of us. Thanks to ourselves. I'm just curious, of all the actions you mentioned, or even those that you might not have mentioned, if you had a magic wand and you could just say, okay, that is now changed, that is now possible, yeah, what would you use that for? So on the education side, the policy, the workforce development, yeah, there's so many. I know that's a kind of a really hard. No, I understand. I'm just curious what like bubbles to the top for you.
Yeah. So what I think if you look at what's happening, excuse me, I take a sip of water. If you look at what's happening in the automobile industry, and the exciting emergence of so many zero emission vehicle options that have come out in the last year or two, it's quickly changing the options that are available and how people are considering the value add of an electric vehicle, right? It's like, oh, I'm no longer worried about my range. And now it seems as though people are investing in charging infrastructure everywhere. So that just doesn't seem like it's a huge lift, right? And then I can go about making other decisions that impact my life, right? Because this is not something that is necessarily at the top of everyone's decision point for those that need cars. So I think the same thing in the building kind of area is we're only as progressive as our options, right? And so I think that having a immediately available low cost electric heat pump that gets everyone to be able to change how they think about heating and cooling spaces and it's easy to install, and it brings down your utility bills, like all of those things which are on the horizon, it would quickly change how we think about existing in our built environment and in our homes in a way that I think would be very important.